2, I call the member for Fadden.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. Many members have stood in this House and regaled stories of great heroism, of survival, of tragedy and of sadness. And whilst those stories have become matters of public record, and history will record some of the great deeds that were done during the floods. I want to put on the public record my thanks to our fighting men and women who did so much for so many in a time of need. For so many years, Australia's fighting men and women have come to the fore, not just to protect Australia's interests at home and abroad, but protect Australians in time of desperate need in national emergency. And it's fitting that I focus just on what our fighting men and women, the Australian Defence Force, contributed during that horror period of some weeks, not just in Queensland but around the country, when Mother Nature wreaked her worst across this wide brown land we call home. In the aftermath of much of the devastation in Queensland, Headquarters Joint Task Force 637 commenced conducting Operation Queensland Flood Assist. This task force, based at Enoggera Barracks in Brisbane, was commanded by Major General Mick Slater, seconded to the Commonwealth to lead Queensland's Flood Recovery Task Force. Major General Slater was a Queenslander, former commander of Australian-led forces in East Timor. He'd earned a Distinguished Service Cross for his command in East Timor, was also commander of Army's 1st Division based at Gallipolis Barracks. In March 2006, he led the response to Cyclone Larry, and can I assure all of the nation, Major General Slater is a bloody good bloke and doing an outstanding job. At the time, the ADF Commander, Colonel Luke Foster, also assumed command, replaced by Brigadier McLaughlin, when Brigadier McLaughlin assumed command of the Joint Task Force on the 17th of January. In fact, ADF elements have been assisting since December 28 in Queensland, and then assistance had roamed across the country. At its height, more than 1,900 Army, Navy and Air Force personnel were deployed to support the Queensland people and wider abroad across Victoria as well. Elements of the 6th Battalion, who were reserve forces staying back when the battalion deployed to war, were sent out to assist. Men and women were recalled from leave to assist in the same manner. The ADF also provided significant specialist capabilities and, importantly, the manpower that was desperately needed in the aftermath of the floods in Cyclone Yasi. Troops from the 8th 9th Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, were deployed to the heart-wrenching search and recovery tasks in Grantham and Lockyer Valleys. Soldiers from Gallipoli Barracks at Enoggera deployed to assist with general support. ADF helicopters provide a vital early response and brought in supplies and conducted some of the most daring airlift rescues during the day and, more importantly, at night, to the point where commanders of aircraft had said that operational flying in Afghanistan and Iraq didn't compare to what they had to endure, especially on that fateful night of Tuesday, the 11th of January. But more than the great logistic resources our fighting men and women brought, they brought one of the greatest things needed in time of disaster. They brought confidence. Nothing can recall the joy of people on the ground struggling to see when around the corner armoured protected mobility vehicles, Bushmasters, came round with hundreds of soldiers. It lets communities know they are not forgotten, that indeed the Defence Force, that fighting capacity of Anzac renown, had come to support. The confidence that brings to communities is second to none, and person after person recounted to me the sheer joy they felt at seeing our men and women in uniform turned up. It let them know they were not alone. At one point, 19 aircraft were flying continuously out of Rasbate Amberley in support of the Queensland operation. Navy clearance divers were used to survey all of Brisbane's 16 river bridges for damages and blockages. HMAS Huon commenced operations on January the 18th, fitted with obviously sophisticated sonar equipment to search for debris that posed navigational hazards to shipping in Moreton Bay and the Brisbane rivers. Particularly good use for a mine hunter, I would have thought. Joint Task Force 664 was established under the command of Brigade Commander 3 Brigade Stuart Smith to deal with the Cyclone Yasi response. Specialist aviation engineering, health and logistic assets were on standby. Patients were transferred from Cairns to Brisbane, completely emptying the Cairns-based hospital on board Royal Australian Air Force C-130 Hercules and two C-17 Globemasters. 50 elderly Townsville residents were also transferred from a nursing home, and ADF assisted Queensland Police in droves. My only disappointment in the ADF response was the lack of an amphibious capability that would have been desperately needed. However, that's a matter of the public record. If we work through on a day-by-day basis, the nation can get a feel for the capability and resources that the ADF put into assisting victims. On the 1st of January, a RAF Hercules flew to flood-devastated Emerald, where 1,200 people had already abandoned their homes. The last route to Rockhampton had been cut. Madam Deputy Speaker, the member for Capricornia, as 3 Defence Force helicopters provide the city's only lifeline of food and medical supplies, which is lucky for you because you're probably too thin already. On the 3rd of January, Defence, working closely with Queensland Emergency Services, provided a range of subject matter expertise, planned and coordinated ADF support, provided support in evacuating people from Theodore, Emerald and Condolence. Emergency food drops were conducted and medical supplies were also provided. 3 Army Black Hawk helicopters provided relief support for Emerald, relocating to Rockhampton for relief works with the Fitzroy River. On the 5th of January, C-130J Hercules sent groceries up to Mackay. Air Force personnel are now working 12 hours and around the clock loading pallets on aircraft. Resupply flights were occurring up to 3 times a day. 50 tonnes of groceries were being delivered on the day, including long-life milk, Weet-Bix, batteries, pasta, baked rice, Coke, important in a flood, clearly toilet paper, nappies and baby formula to Rockhampton and Mackay to keep our regional cities moving. The 6th of January, the Royal Australian Navy evacuated the local hospital in the town of St George. In fact, not even a lightning strike could stop the delivery of rescue supplies from RAF Base Amberley, a Hercules transport aircraft being forced to return after being hit during a supply mission. RAF Base Richmond C-130 aircraft and Defence staff based at Richmond began airlifting supplies north to flood-stricken Queensland towns. Townsville-based Chinook started bringing in water filtration plants, and Royal Australian Navy Commander Paul Magash and his aircraft commander, Lieutenant Commander Tansy Lee, were recorded trying to reach flood victims in the Lockyer Valley. It's recorded that low cloud, high winds, a lightning storm and rain that came in like a wall all combined to make it impossible, yet they still landed their platform. The 11th of January, that fateful Tuesday night, 2 Sea King helicopters redeployed from Roma and then to Oakey and then to Amberley. 2 more Black Hawk aircraft, Black Hawk 220 and 201, also based at Amberley. These 4 helicopters evacuated up to 300 people from Forest Hill to an evacuation centre in Gatton. Indeed, 1 aircraft, Black Hawk 201, that fateful night, rescued 146 people by itself. Hundreds of people are alive because 4 platforms, 2 Black Hawks and 2 Seahawk aircraft, responded at a time in dreadful conditions, at night with full night vision goggles, in torrential rain, in horrendous conditions with power lines down, antennas everywhere, flying throughout the night. The 12th of January, 223 ADF personnel, 15 helicopter, 6 fixed-wing aircraft, trucks, water purification attachments and other ADF specialist equipment flown in to start assisting communities. On the 13th of January, Private Mitchell Mead, a reservist with the 9th Battalion, the Royal Australian Regiment, is pictured there in the newspaper, unloading local sandbags along with most of the 9th Battalion, including trucks. The entire Army Reserve unit turned out to support their community. 15 protected mobility vehicles, bush rangers, 16 trucks, ambulances, over 100 troops deployed to Toowoomba and the Lockyer Valley to commence the clean-up and the search and rescue. Amazing stories started to appear about what our fighting men and women were doing. Tons of food are now arriving on the 16th of January at Townsville Base 1 Airfield Operations Support Squadron. 25 reservists from Delta Company, the 9th Battalion, the Royal Queensland Regiment, in Gympie to assist the Gympie Regional Council as part of its civil restoration. The minesweeper Hewan is now working in the Moreton Bay looking for debris. 2 Royal Australian Navy hydrographic ships are now assisting. 600 ADF personnel are now working in communities in Brisbane, Toowoomba, Rockhampton, Townsville, Amberley, Roma, Theodore and St George. C-17 Globemasters, C-130 Hercules aircraft and as many aviation assets that are not deployed in our combat zones are now working in southeast Queensland. An unbelievable effort from our Defence Force in aid of the civil community. An unbelievable effort. And nothing recounts and regales more regarding the ADF's effort without diminishing anything that our individual sailors, soldiers and airmen did than to look at Black Hawk's 220-201 and the 2 Sea King aircraft that flew that fateful night on Tuesday, the 11th of January. Corporal T.J. Southwood, Lieutenant Colonel Tim Winterton, Petty Officer Nicola Anderson, Lieutenant Commander Scott Palmer, Chief Petty Officer Kerwin Ballico, Lieutenant Simon Dressen, Corporal Rob Nelson, Warrant Officer Tony Young, Sergeant Bryson. Some of the names of the pilots and crew that flew those 4 airframes, rescuing up to 300 Queenslanders trapped on roofs, trapped in ceilings, trapped on top of carports, many of them having waited for 8 hours in the most horrendous conditions of rain and squall and storm. And you can almost picture it. Mum and Dad and the kids huddled on the roof, unsure, phone lines down, no electricity, not even knowing if anyone knew where they were. And suddenly a sound fills the air above the raging storm. Lights start to flash in between the raindrops, and a black thunderous shape stops above them, and in a sling down comes a man trying not to swing wildly as the breeze picks him up, as the winch operator is trying to land him on the size of a desk in these tremendous conditions. If you could have looked up from that roof, you would have seen in the cockpit 2 pilots, night vision goggles sticking out of their eye, desperately trying to keep a helicopter in a hover in horrendous conditions. You should have seen a winch operator hanging out the side of an aircraft, saturated, goggles steamed up, night vision goggles there, in the most horrendous conditions trying to avoid live power lines as he sent a junior soldier down the wire to begin picking up people. And that's how over 300 were rescued that night, person by person, house by house. That's the calibre of the fighting men and women that we have and the calibre of those who rescued Australians. Who can forget that immortalised image of a warrant officer saturated, exhausted, goggles fogged up from the heat of his breathing in his eyes, holding a bedraggled small little child completely saturated that he literally snatched to bring back up into a helicopter. So as my parliamentary colleagues quite rightly talk about the flood and its victims, talk about the horror and the sadness, the joys, the delights, the heroes, let me just put on the record that there are a group of men and women, up to 2,000, who served our nation because the Minister of Defence called them out and they got their heels together and served, as do almost 3,000 of our fighting men and women across the world today. Many of them unsung heroes. Many of them will not know the actions they did on those fateful days and that fateful night. Yet saving hundreds of lives is without doubt and beyond dispute because of the capability and the capacity of our fighting men and women. We as a nation are truly blessed to have such a professional fighting force that is so well trained, that is so willing to risk appropriately to save other Australians. It's a credit to the Anzac spirit. It is a credit to us as a nation. Whilst no one would wish such a devastating flood and cyclone upon us again, I know in my heart that should such devastation again visit our shores, our fighting men and women will once again rise to the challenge, because that is who they are and that is what they do. If if I can speak on behalf of all Queenslanders and all those in Victoria who were so ably assisted and so ably helped, we thank them for their service that went above and beyond.